Hi everyone, it is I, Jackie, with another silly hat. It's a very hot hat and it's a very silly one. It's not a skunk, it's just a silly hat. But this week's topic is not silly. Um, we're going to bounce off what we've been talking about before and start getting into treaties. And treaties, sometimes people think it's a simple concept, but it's actually a lot more complex than non-Indigenous people tend to think, and the way they talk about it in history class sometimes doesn't include a lot of Indigenous perspectives. So a lot of some of this will hark back to things we've been learning. Again, Sego. I should start with that, right? So what are treaties exactly? Well, it depends who you ask. Is it a cessation of land? Cessation means giving up. When we talked about land acknowledgements in the first week, you might remember that term unceded, right? And we say we're on unceded territory, meaning it wasn't given up. So ceding refers to cessation, right? So some people, and that's probably what you learn in history sometimes, is like if you can convince other people to give up their land and get them to sign a treaty, well, that land's yours. Or is it an agreement to share? Okay, so these are different perspectives, and I'm sure just looking at this, you can guess which people's worldviews are represented by each of these options. So, this week's work, a lot of it is based on Chelsea Vowell, chapter 27, but there are some other links in there. So this kind of goes with the reading questions. Reading question 1 has to do with Chelsea Vowell's chapter, and the second reading question has to do with a couple of links that I sent, and these links will be discussed here as well. So we'll just kind of, go over the kind of important points here. So the chapter covers early treaties, and there's another chapter after that covers ones that came after. So here in this chapter, Vowell is really dealing with treaties that happened between Indigenous people and European nations before Canada became a country. Because sometimes, people forget that there's so much that happened in terms of colonization before Canada became a country. And before that point, before Confederation, Indigenous people were dealing with the British, the French, for the most part, in some places the Dutch, because again you have Indigenous people who their boundaries weren't, their territories weren't didn't match up with the boundaries of between the U.S. and Canada, for example. So when we talk about here locally, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, which includes Ganyankahaga people or Mohawk, well, their lands stretched over what is now that boundary between the U.S. and Canada. So there was some contact with the Dutch as well, which is going to be relevant here. So we're talking about, again, before Confederation, before Canada was a nation, so we're talking about European nations, all right? We're not talking about Canada as such yet. So you can read this chapter and you really see Vowell emphasizes here and there the differences in worldview between Indigenous nations and European nations. We're still being very, remember that thing about how we're supposed to be very specific? That'll come. Right now we're talking in general terms, okay? So Indigenous treaty making. So before, this isn't a section of the chapter, but it is discussed a little bit. And I also wanted to add in some stuff to help you make connections with what we've learned already. So before Europeans showed up here, remember, Indigenous peoples were, many of them, many nations, many cultures existed and here for thousands of years. In relationships to their land. We've talked about that. This very deep connection to the land and everything that's alive, right? So there were treaties that existed between Indigenous nations before Europeans came. Let's face it, humans are human everywhere. There are conflicts. All right, so we've already learned about the Great Law of Peace that was created to bring the Haudenosaunee peoples together, right? These 5 nations who, at some point had started being, coming into conflict, and the peacemaker came and established the Great Law of Peace. That was a kind of treaty, and it was an agreement to share space and to coexist and to engage in peaceful relations. That was a treaty, okay? These were oral agreements, okay? So for the most part, up in this part of the world, you didn't have like these formal systems of writing, so agreements were done orally and sometimes through other means, as we'll see with the two-row wampum, right? So there were materials that could be made to symbolize an oral agreement. But they were very sophisticated. It wasn't like, okay, yeah, fine, right? They were very deep and they covered a lot of stuff. And, sometimes an agreement could take days and days to just even describe verbally. So people had to have that all in their head. That's wicked sophisticated. So a lot of it centered on trade because, different materials were available in different places and people sometimes wanted each other's stuff. So to avoid doing that with bloodshed, you can have these agreements where people trade. Ways to resolve conflicts that, even if you agree to be peaceful, conflicts are going to happen, right? And also, and this is going to come back, there was a focus on renewal, renegotiation, and change. So Vowell talks about this like a relationship. So treaties in indigenous worldviews are relationships. And she equates it with any kind of relationship, whether it be a friendship or a romantic relationship, where, when you meet somebody and if you decide to spend your life with someone in a relationship or someone's, you decide to form a family in whatever way you choose to define family. When you meet, you're at a certain stage in your life, and maybe 5 years later, 10 years later, whatever, you grow and you change as individuals, and therefore the relationship evolves as well. So relationships need constant tending. So if you're in a kind of relationship that does require some kind of contract, for example, you buy a house with someone or whatever, that if somebody changes their mind, then you need to renegotiate that agreement. It doesn't just sit there and it's not binding necessarily forever in that state. It can change and evolve with the circumstances. Again, like relationships, your friendships change over time, your romantic or sexual relationships change over time because people's needs change. And this is how Indigenous people view treaties. All right, they're created and they're over the long term, but as needs change, they can be renegotiated, but they also need to be maintained. People need to kind of constantly come back together and reaffirm the existence of this relationship. You need to take care of this relationship. Okay, so this is important to know. And okay, so early treaty making with Europeans. So now we're getting into what some of what Chelsea Vowell talks about in terms of these early relations. So when the first settlers came, that original goal wasn't necessarily to kind of take over, right? That's what we retain sometimes, but really they were coming and looking for stuff. The fur trade was huge, and there was other things that people wanted to take back to Europe. So there were commercial relations, relatively peaceful for the most part, at least up here in the north. When you go further south, where in places where Spain colonized, there's a lot more brutality there. But up here was relatively peaceful in those early times. We're talking like 1600s here, even before. Indigenous people still outnumbered Europeans, right? So even if the Europeans would have wanted to take over, that wasn't going to happen. And European nations recognized indigenous nations as sovereign and self-governing. So there wasn't this view necessarily that they were going to take over. That came later, partly through politics, but also religion played a goal as well, because you had the church at one point who were saying, well, these people aren't humans, they're not real human, they weren't baptized. So and that kind of that went together with the political side of things, but we're not there yet. So Europeans pretty much kind of abided by indigenous treaty protocols. All right, they were able to kind of learn from each other, and different indigenous nations did things differently. So Europeans would make arrangements with different people in different places according to local customs. Okay, and Europeans, were very much into the written documentation thing, right? And then we see that in today's institutions, whether they're academic or anything, it's like all about the written word and the signed contract. So they added that element, but it wasn't to overpower the other side. It was just to kind of blend the traditions. Okay, so that's fine so far so good. Why does this never work the right way? It's really annoying. So to continue on that topic of this early treaty making between indigenous people and peoples and Europeans. And again, we're talking about European nations, so the powers that were still back in Europe, but they would negotiate with obviously their representatives here. So the first formal treaties between indigenous nations and Europeans really centered on peace, trade, and conflict resolution, because again, if within a nation there can be conflict, there's going to be conflict between peoples as well. But so how do we resolve them? If we have a treaty, we have a relationship, we can find ways to resolve this. Okay, this should say war here, not way. So European nations were at war with each other, remember? So you had the British coming, the French, the Dutch a little bit as well, and they wanted to take over this big vast continent with all its riches eventually, right? But at the beginning they were just trying to break ground and have commercial monopoly over the other Europeans. So they were really trying to kind of create allyships with different indigenous nations. So a lot of the treaties had to do with that. So you're going to read a little bit in Chelsea Vowell about the two-row wampum, and here's an image of it right here. And you, in question 2 in this week's assignment, there are also there's a page to read and a video as well of Oren Lyons, who talks about the two-row wampum a little bit. And it's just a little 4-minute segment of a much longer talk. So the two-row wampum, so in the PowerPoint here, I'm bringing in some of that other stuff about the two-row wampum. So we're talking about it quite a bit because again, it's linked to what we've been learning about Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and it's going to come back in the future as well, because a lot of the ideas behind the two-row wampum are used as a basis to understand later agreements. So what is it? Originally, it was a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. All right, so Haudenosaunee, remember, we're talking about 5 nations here. The first ones who encountered the Dutch were the Kanien'kehá:ka, because the Kanien'kehá:ka's lands kind of came up to around here. This was pretty much the northern limit, but extended into New York State. So the Dutch were kind of coming up from, where New York is today, where New York City is today. So, the wampum belt is made up of quahog shells, and, there's a video. It's gone now. I used to show this in my classes. It was beautiful. It's like a 9-minute video, and it was an indigenous scholar who talked about these shells, and this was something that women did, and they would, it would take just one little shell, would take hours and hours, or maybe even a full day. And there are tons and tons of them in here, right? They come in these 2 colors, apparently, these little quahogs. So you can Google what that creature is if you're more interested in that. But so these wampum belts, and this isn't the only kind of wampum belt. I mean, these were used again as a form of documentation. They were symbols of oral agreements. And so the two-row wampum, which is symbolized by this particular wampum belt here, some people say wampum. I've learned wampum. So there might be regional differences. So the two-row wampum wasn't actually written down by the Haudenosaunee, okay? Even though the Dutch wanted to write everything down, and they did, but the two-row wampum aspect of it, from the Haudenosaunee perspective, didn't need to, because it was agreed upon orally. Everybody was there, they all agreed on it, and this is what symbolized it. So the two-row wampum wound up being considered to being kind of, from the Haudenosaunee perspective, a foundational treaty, meaning that it was a basis for ongoing relations with Europeans and a basis for further treaties. Okay, so Gazwenda, the great river of life, and Oren Lyons, that's how he describes it in the video. But Chelsea Vowell talks about this concept a little bit as well in her chapter, and it's really this broad concept, because again, it's a great river of life, but it symbolizes all of this, this relationship that respects the identity and sovereignty of 2 peoples who are coming together, mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and the idea is that neither interferes with the other's canoe. Okay, so that's the visual here. If we go back to the previous slide, it's a river, and you have these two canoes, or a canoe and a European-style ship side by side, each with its own needs, its own ways, and neither they coexist. They respect each other, and Oren Lyon explains it beautifully, and so does that other article from Briar Patch Magazine that you're reading for question 2 this week. And so they don't interfere with each other. So that's the idea of this agreement. It's like, okay, we'll share space and we each do our own thing, and we won't interfere with each other, try to veer each other off course. Now, something that Vowell doesn't get into, although she talks about similar things in other sections of the chapter, so, she has to fit in a lot of information to this one small chapter here, but this other article that you're going to be reading by Tom Kiefer, the Dutch originally had proposed a more paternalistic relationship. Like, they were going to be the dads, and the Haudenosaunee were going to be the kids, and the Dutch were going to look after them, right? So, and this, is when we look at other treaties later on in the whole Canadian system that eventually came with the Indian Act, there's a lot of that paternalism there. But the Haudenosaunee refuted that. They insisted that the relationship was going to be a fraternal one, and and here's a nice little quote from that article. "We shall each travel the river together, side by side, but in our own boat. Neither of us will make compulsory laws or interfere in the internal affairs of the other. Neither of us will try to steer the other's vessel." So that harks back to what we said in the previous slides, that mutual respect for self-determination and sovereignty. As you probably know by now, that didn't last because, life happened. So there, in that same article, so John Burroughs, who, if you're into law and politics, and if this is what you want to do at a career and you want to bring in Indigenous worldviews, you have to read John Burroughs. Write that down somewhere. Go read his stuff, even if it's not now. If you're in university, you're in law school or whatever, political science, or if you have an interest in this stuff, John Burroughs is phenomenal in terms of like historical developments and law and politics. So he's quoted in that same article that you're going to read, and Oren Lyons is the one in the video. Okay, so this quote is from John Burroughs in the article, but Oren Lyons says sensibly the same thing, right? And he's explaining again, this is kind of repetition, but just I want you to kind of be exposed to different ways of saying the same thing sometimes. It's interesting because each way of saying it adds its own little flavor. So the belt consists of 2 rows of purple wampum beads on a white background, which we saw. 3 rows of white beads symbolizing peace, friendship, and respect separate 2 purple rows. The 2 purple rows symbolize 2 paths or 2 vessels traveling down the same river. 1 row symbolizes the Haudenosaunee people with their law and customs, while the other row symbolizes European laws and customs. As nations move together side by side on the river of life, which we saw that term before, I wrote it down, Gazwenda, they are to avoid overlapping or interfering with one another. So, again, different ways of saying the same thing. So Chelsea Vowell touches on this very, very briefly, but even the idea of the covenant chain is very interesting. And here's another link. This is not one that you have to read, but I put it there in case you want more information. They talk about the covenant chain. Chelsea Vowell refers to it. So in their article about the 2-row wampum, they added this tidbit where, so for the Haudenosaunee, all they needed was this belt that symbolized a verbal agreement, but the Dutch insisted on recording this on paper, but their symbolism was 3 silver chains, okay? Iron chains would rust, but silver can be polished and renewed when the brothers meet. And the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch agreed to call this the Silver Covenant Chain of Friendship. And that's really interesting because it kind of is in line with that idea that we talked about earlier, that indigenous worldview. So the Dutch were kind of on board with that worldview of saying, okay, we're coming into this relationship, but it needs to be maintained. We need to, every time we see each other, we polish the silver to make it shine again, right? And if you have any inherited silverware in your family, like the old-fashioned good quality silver stuff, I don't. We're that kind of family, but some people do. Like eventually the color changes and you have to polish it. So that it's like that's kind of neat in a way, because it's like a similar idea but from two different cultural perspectives. Um, and one thing that's interesting that I'm just going to throw in is last year around this time, before the pandemic, you might remember hearing in the news about the land back movement, or shut down Canada, where Indigenous peoples across the land were acting in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en Nation in British Columbia, who were, who'd been attacked by the RCMP. The government was, and companies were trying to put a pipeline through their lands, and they were resisting. And some Haudenosaunee peoples, as well as Six Nations and other places. And at one point, Mark Miller, who is federal MP, and he's the one in, Indigenous relations, or I'm not sure what they're calling it these days. They keep changing the name of that thing. But he went and met up with some people at one of the barricades on a rail line, and he actually used this terminology: "I'm here to polish the covenant chain." So people, for in Haudenosaunee views, this is still exists. It just hasn't been respected by Europeans, and now some European Canadians, or as part of the federal government, are kind of using that language sometimes to try to show good faith. So that's interesting. All right. So that was a little reference that I found really interesting around this time last year. So hundreds of covenant chain treaties followed. Vowell talks about this between the Haudenosaunee and then other European nations who came in and followed that Dutch model. So the whole saying also, as long as the grass is green. So again, if you follow this particular link here, that's the one you're going to be reading for this week's assignment from Briar Patch Magazine, written by Tom Kiefer. And, just to kind of, again, come back to that idea of the differences in worldview. The Haudenosaunee view of the two-row wampum and similar treaties was that they were to last forever, as long as the grass grows green, as long as the sun rises, and all these kinds of things. But they were going to last forever, but they needed constant renewal and maintenance. So ceremonial events, gift exchanges, what have you, okay? And the Dutch agreed, right, with the whole polishing the silver chain thing. The British, when they started making these kinds of agreements, these covenant chain agreements, they were like, yeah, whatever, we'll do it just to make the natives happy, kind of thing. But they didn't really see the need, okay? In the British view of treaties was that, you sign the thing, then you leave it alone. It's just static, unchanging agreement. You never need to look at it again. You don't even need to talk to those people again because they signed, so hey, it's done, right? Very different idea. It's for the British, it's a contract. For Haudenosaunee and other indigenous peoples, it's a relationship. You're entering into a relationship. And Chelsea Vowell makes the equation with marriage, right? We talked about this before, relationships, but specifically marriage. It's like if you go to a wedding and then people get married to each other and they make their vows and then they sign whatever paperwork they have to sign, but then they never have to take care of each other again or do anything together because the contract says they're married, so they don't actually have to act married, right? That's kind of the British view of the treaties. Whereas with Haudenosaunee, they're like, no, you have to kind of maintain this relationship. You have to take care of each other and learn about each other and, respect each other. So very different, and we'll see that continues to be an issue, a point of contention. So this is very briefly mentioned, but we'll try to come back to this at some point in the semester because it's very local. It actually happened in Tiohtià:ke on the island of Montreal, the Great Peace of 1701. So, you had these covenant chain agreements, and in other places there were other treaties that were happening between, say, the French and other nations. And again, this is all in the context where, these European powers, we know this, right? You can learn this in high school history, right? They were at war with each other to try to claim pieces of these lands, right? So they, and then because they would form allyships with different indigenous nations, that contributed to existing conflicts between indigenous nations, and there were conflicts that are very old here. Haudenosaunee often were at war with other peoples, and there were people trying to control the trade of goods that existed on this continent. So humans are humans, right? So these these different nations were becoming allies with different colonial powers, and so that kind of made those tensions worse. So here's an example of an alliance treaty between Innu, Wendat, and Algonquin, all First Nations, and the French against the Haudenosaunee, and eventually against the British, right? So it's tricky. So then later came non-aggression pacts. So the Haudenosaunee and the French tried to make peace. It didn't really work out. This is a very extreme summary, right? Chelsea Vowell mentioned that this conflict continued for about 100 years until the Great Peace of 1701, which established that the Haudenosaunee were neutral towards the British and the French. And I once went to a talk by someone from Ganawage, who's Ganyangehaga, sorry, and he was saying that at that time they said, no, we will never, because some Haudenosaunee people actually allied with the French as well, apparently, and there was a split there between communities, and they said, never will we split again. So, these are complex things. So there's another section in the textbook, well, in Chelsea Vowell's not really a textbook, we're using it as one, but in Chelsea Vowell's book, Peace and Friendship Treaties, so she gives a very extreme summary here as well, and just kind of going a bit forward in time here, in this period of time, you still have this kind of focus on trade relations and military alliance, so that's not necessarily new, but just kind of like it evolved in a different way. So we've talked about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but there was also a bit further northeast, the Wabanaki Confederacy, that brought a few First Nations together, and they had this kind of friendship, peace and friendship treaty with the British. But, again, in all this, there are ongoing differences in views about the meanings of treaties. So just to reiterate, for Indigenous peoples, and for the most part here we're talking about different First Nations, right? We're saying Indigenous peoples to kind of like be inclusive of a broad range of people, but most of the people we're talking about so far, at least in this chapter, are First Nations, because the Inuit were still kind of doing their own thing, and there was less, they were interfered with a bit later in massive ways. So, but nevertheless, the Indigenous views and of these particular First Nations, there's that maintenance idea, right? There's ceremonies, gift giving to maintain the relationship, and the British were like, ugh, we don't need to do this, but fine, we'll do it to make them happy, right? So that was still going on. So this, one of the last sections of Chelsea Vowell's chapter, she's talking about pre-Confederation treaties. So now we're getting closer to the point in time where Canada becomes a country, right? And British power was increasing. There were more and more. Remember at the beginning we said like European settlers and explorers and traders, they were still outnumbered by Indigenous people on the continent, but that was shifting, right? And also the British were bringing their guns and stuff and their armies, so there was increased focus on treaties to gain more land for settlers, because now, at first when Europeans came, again, we haven't talked about this yet, but there's exploitation colonialism, where you go in and you take stuff and you leave, and then there's settler colonialism, where you come and you want to settle down. So this was moving more towards settler colonialism, so they wanted more land to put these settlers on. And at the same time, you had the American Revolution, right? And you had loyalists from the United States, people who were loyal to the British Crown, who wound up coming to Canada, and or what was becoming Canada, and they wanted to make room for them as well. So she names some here, and this is something that if you're a history buff or you want to know more about this, these are examples of treaties that you can learn about. And they're documents, again, by the British, describing, okay, which lands we're getting, which nations are giving them to us, and what compensation are we going to give them. So again, we're back to that idea of cessation of land, right? We've moved away from peace and friendship and military allyship and mutual respect to, we're going to get your land, you'll get something in return, and we'll learn. When we talk about treaties, again, the second part, our second class, when we talk about treaties, we'll find out that a lot of the stuff that was said were lies. So there were promises made orally to indigenous people who couldn't necessarily read this stuff because they had their own system of communication, and the translations were not always accurate, so there were a lot of lies, and the compensations honestly were not always followed up on. So again, with pre-Confederation treaties, mutual respect was fading at this point, right? So the British were really, they were making promises that indigenous peoples could keep using their lands, and we'll learn later on about how often these were lies. But what was interesting, and what Chelsea Vowell points out, is that had never come up before because that was never in question, because it was never about cessation of land. So now you start to have these treaties where the British is saying, well, we're going to take your land, we'll give you something in return. Don't worry, even though you gave us the land, we'll still let you use it. But remember, they could say this orally, but for the British, oral promises were meaningless. It had to be written down. So it makes me think, how most of us sign things, we don't necessarily read all the fine print? Well, there you go. So British incursion disrupted ways of life, moved communities, interrupted trade routes. So even before things were negotiated, sometimes they'd be barging into people's territories, sometimes uprooting and moving people by force, or coercing them to move, or just occupying so much space that around them that people's way of life was affected. Because if you subsist on say hunting migratory animals, then you have all these other humans who are interfering with the migration routes of those animals. That's going to mess things up for you. Same with trade routes. Again, there were very well established trade routes between indigenous nations across the continent, and these became disrupted by colonists. And around the same time, so again, the closer we get to the creation of Canada, we start to see, for example, the Indian Act, which we'll learn about, which wound up legislating First Nations identities, existed a few years before Canada. So they were already starting to think in terms of assimilating Indigenous peoples. And that's, where a lot of other problems started. And we'll learn about that. But for now, it's very clear that assimilation, even though sometimes it was couched in religious terms, which you had, say the church that had power back in the churches that had power back in Europe, the Vatican even would say things like, well, these people don't have souls, right? So we can assimilate them and make them Christian and save their souls, or give them souls, or whatever. But that was made to seem as though it were well-meaning, but really it was just a way for the political aspect of it to kind of be able to get more stuff, right? Sorry if I'm becoming incoherent, it's very late. But basically, like as in a lot of cases, religion was used as a justification for political maneuvers and political dominance. And again, we'll talk more about that. So interpretation of treaties. This is the very last section of Chelsea Vowell's chapter. And what's interesting, as a result of all those things that happened, back in the 1600s, 1700s, we're left with a lot of non-Indigenous people kind of abiding by that British interpretation of treaties. Because again, that's what we learn in high school, right? Treaties around the world is about a contract that's on paper and it's set in stone. And so when different First Nations or other Indigenous people try to kind of fight for their ancestral land rights, often they have to deal with Canadian courts who traditionally haven't usually been on the sides of Indigenous people. But more recently, and Vowell points this out, they're trying to make some room for Indigenous interpretations of treaties in their own kind of colonial way. So there's still problems with it, but there are some attempts. And you can see a list of things on page 249. One thing that I'm picking out as interesting here that I wanted to take a moment to talk about is that you have sometimes in the courts you will see that kind of a gaining among some non-Indigenous people of an understanding of the weight that has always been attributed in Indigenous societies to oral agreements. So sometimes, in some circumstances, they might tend to give more weight to oral agreements that would have been made at the time. So there's some little progress. It's not as much as a lot of Indigenous people would like, but Vowell kind of acknowledges this, even though we'll see there's still very many problems with the process. So, oh, duplicate slide. Sorry about that. I'll remove it before sending. So, I like these little quirks, though. I mean, some people might say, oh, that Jackie's so disorganized. There are typos, and I'm like, you know what? I like to think it makes me more human and approachable, because if I'm not perfect, then I can't expect you to be. You can let me know what you think of that. Maybe you don't agree. That's okay. So I always end the slides, right, with a few relevant anthropological concepts. So here we go. These are ones we've seen before. So I like to, as we go along, just kind of tie them in with concrete things that we're talking about. So culture, culture is always relevant. We're talking about a set of beliefs and practices that is learned and shared by a group. And, again, there are many, many indigenous cultures, and we're tying this into political organization. So political organization, in anthropology, we're really talking about the way in which any society, or even groups of societies, for example, the Haudenosaunee, right, consisted originally of 5 nations, now 6. How do they organize themselves in terms of power and decision making? So we're not talking necessarily about, like, say, Parliament Hill or l'Assemblée Nationale or Washington, D.C. and these kind of institutions. We're talking about, like, so even a small society that has egalitarian principles where people make decisions by consensus, for example, and if there's a conflict, they have a talking circle so everybody talks about it, instead of putting somebody in jail or punishing them or giving them a fine. That's still political organization. So it's how is power distributed, how do people make decisions, how do they resolve conflicts, okay? So the Haudenosaunee is an example of that. Everything that we're talking about in terms of treaty relations, that's part of political relations. Worldview is a term that came up a lot this week. I was going to say this semester. Wow. So we're only on our 4th week here. But it's, it comes up a lot, and it's a very complex topic. In fact, you usually take a humanities course that's all about worldviews, right? So in a nutshell, it's the way people understand or interpret reality. So it's very complex. And every culture has a worldview, but not all people within a culture share all the elements of a worldview, because each person has their own as well. So as an individual, we all have our worldviews, and that's shaped by the culture or cultures that we're brought up in, because sometimes we're brought up in more than one, and our own individual positions within our society. So depending on your gender, depending on a whole bunch of things about you that set you apart from other people in your society, that's going to shape your life experience. And different kinds of experiences will change your worldview as well. So it's something that evolves over the course of a lifetime. But there's still aspects of worldview that are shared between people in a culture. So when we talked about these treaties and the views that different people have of a treaty, so with indigenous worldviews, even though there are many cultures, there's some things that are shared between the worldviews of these different cultures, and one of them was this view of treaties as relationships. Whereas European nations, for the most part, even though they were also had different cultures, shared a similar worldview when it came to, like, these contracts that were set in stone. We didn't talk about it, but ethnocentrism is very relevant here, right? Because all humans will have the tendency to assess new knowledge according to our own culture or worldview. So obviously, so for somebody who's non-Indigenous and who learns about Indigenous ways of treaty making centered on an oral tradition and oral agreements, might have an ethnocentric reaction of, like, well, why didn't they just write it down, right? And if that's all you're used to and that's what you think is the right way, of course you're going to have that reflect. And in anthropology, we're inviting you to try to see things from other people's point of view that you might not be familiar with. Okay, and of course that goes in all directions. And when we saw that example between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee, that was one example that we kind of see, and I wasn't there, so I'm just going on what I've been reading, right? But it seems to me that the whole thing with the silver chains being polished on one hand and the 2 canoes on the other, and that agreement, that mutual, they kind of met in the middle somehow and go, okay, yeah, this is something that needs to be maintained over time and reestablished. So that's one way in which people were kind of able to overcome those ethnocentric reactions. So there you go. That's it for this week. I hope that this material is interesting to you. We'll pursue the treaties. We'll actually see a film on treaties, a fabulous film by Alanis Obomsawin sometime in the very near future that's going to revisit some of this and take it into the future. So as usual, if you have any questions, let me know.